Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics, and this is the Primary Arms Platinum line 1:8 variable magnification optic. I've been meaning to check out Primary Arms Platinum line of optics for some time now, and I finally got the opportunity. Primary Arms actually sent this 1:8 out to me for me to check out. This particular one has the Griffin reticle, Griffin Mil reticle, which is a reticle that you see pop up from time to time in certain optics, and it's Mil-centric in a way, in the fact that it's not a traditional like a TMR or an MOA reticle, although it does give you a lot of the features and the abilities that you'd get from reticle like that. Now this is a first focal plane 1:8, which is a very popular configuration, if you will. We're getting closer to 1:6s and 1:8s, and even 1:10s becoming more standard versus, 10 years ago, you'd see 1:4 being the primary optic you'd get. And really it comes down to eye relief. Usually the more magnification you add from a 1 power and up, the less eye relief you have, which means the rifle doesn't lend itself as well to quote-unquote CQB fast shooting, snap into sight picture shooting distances, because eye relief is believed to be a problem at those distances, and on some optics it is. So getting into this optic, I mean, any 1:8 I'm going to be pretty critical of for those close distance shooting, but I also want to make sure that the reticle's provided that gives me an advantage of going to 8 power, because if the reticle doesn't provide me with a holds, just to simplify it, on 8 power, it doesn't serve any purpose other than positive identification. Another thing I look for in optics is clarity of glass, especially in failing light or low light conditions. Now for features, it's a 34mm main tube with eye relief quoted at 3 to almost 4 inches, 3 to 3.9 inches, which I found to be pretty accurate. When I establish a cheek weld on a 1 power setting and I dial into 4, which usually I wouldn't, but I dial straight to 8, I didn't have to reposition my cheek weld or my head once I got standard, once I got positioning good, mounting good for everything for that 1 power setting. Now you can read up a lot on the reticle. This particular one has the ACSS Mil. ACSS is a reticle that pops up, like I said, in a couple different optics, including pistol optics, although it's not the same thing. This one has a horseshoe type bonnet, if you will, inverted horseshoe, which gives you a very clean reticle at 1 power setting, which is something that is advantageous for a first focal plane reticle, being that you can dial it out. The reticle itself shrinks in size relative to the setting of the magnification. If you add your illumination, it gives you the same performance, or ideally the same performance that you'd get from a red dot optic, with the advantage of being able to dial out and hold over for longer distance shots. Or for me, it's more, especially on a general purpose intermediate range rifle, I'm more concerned with positive identification of targets. That's what my magnification desire is mainly for, although it is nice to be able to dial out to 8 power and shoot. On this particular review, I mounted on a 12.5 inch Lantac, being able to dial out and hit targets at extended ranges, 200, 300, even further, provided that the rifle is capable of it, which the Lantac is something I've found to be really accurate over all the years I've had it. So it's a good rifle to use for review on a magnified optic. Now, if you're not familiar with my review process, one of the very first things I'm going to do in a review is I'm going to do a 500 round burn down, which is 500 rounds as quickly as possible, to see if that accelerated rate of fire will identify any issues with the reviewed item, in this case being an optic, that I wouldn't notice with the same round count over a much longer period of time. On a semi-auto rifle, it usually takes me 3 to 4 minutes to do a 500 round burn down, versus the same round count over 3 to 4 weeks or 3 to 4 months, I might not identify some issues. So here's your burn down. First last round, no issue. I ran the illuminated reticle during that on 1 power, just because that's the distance I'd be shooting at in the conditions, of course, daytime. And I didn't get any flickering or fading. One of the failing points that we sometimes see with magnified optics is illuminated reticles. while they're not 100% necessary for second focal plane, which is arguable because the second focal plane, the reticle doesn't change size relative to the magnification setting. On a first focal plane, a lot of people say you have to have illuminated reticle because especially in daylight conditions, on certain targets at certain distances or certain size targets, you may not be able to see the reticle clearly, and I would almost 100% of the time agree with that. So just speaking to the illumination on the 1:8's reticle, it's really good. There isn't a lot of bleeding, if really any noticeable bleeding. And bleeding is something that does occur on certain reticles, just based on the nature of how the illumination is added to the reticle itself. You may have a little bit of, well, it's in the name, bleeding. So at certain points on your actual reticle, your holds, your windage, your TMR lines, whatever the reticle happens to be, you may have a little bit of bloom or flare on certain settings that you can't really get rid of. During the day, not a big deal, especially on 1 power, because on 1 power, that illumination is basically going to give you almost like a red dot like you'd get from a red dot sight. But if I want to dial into 4 or 8 or really any magnification and I'm in lower lighting conditions, that blooming can become problematic and also obscure partially or totally the target I'm actually trying to shoot. On the Primary Arms 1:8, I'm happy to report that the blooming is not an issue, not really noticeable at all unless I go too bright, or I should say too bright for the lighting conditions in which I'm using it in, which basically means for me, for my uses, I would never put it on that setting, so blooming is not something I'm going to notice. Now speaking about glass clarity, because we're going right through that, the glass clarity in failing light is really good for a 1:8. One of the things I've noticed with some other magnified optics is as I increase the magnification, I lose light collection, or I lose noticeable light. So at distance, even running a really powerful weapon light, I may not be able to get that positive indication, or in certain weather conditions, like if it's really humid here in Georgia, the misting in the air that we get at night, I may not be able to see the target at all because the optic just cannot collect the amount of light that I'm actually putting down range. With the Primary Arms, I have to report that is not a problem. It is a really good light collection. As far as battery life goes on your reticle, it's about what I would expect. So you're not going to get red dot length battery life. That's not really that big of a deal, mainly because this is something you're going to turn on when you need it. And just remember to turn it off. You've got multiple brightness settings, so you can adjust for that. Without adding some kind of notch filter to the glass, we're just not going to get the battery life with current technology that we get out of red dot sights. So I consider the battery life that the Primary Arms 1:8 offers to be perfectly reasonable. The particular model that I reviewed has 0.1 MRAD adjustments, which I think is actually really generous considering maybe the intended use for the optic. Yes, you have a maximum setting of 8 power, so you could use this for more of a precision rifle, especially with first focal plane. Some people even like first focal plane for those longer distance guns. I like having the option of a very precise zero, and pretty much anything with a magnified reticle, I'm going to zero for 100 yards. Which is exactly what I did with this rifle. The adjustments are intuitive. One of the things that I really liked about it is just the actual turret design itself. Although they're not captured turrets, I can adjust on the fly. I can remove and return to 0, so I don't have to screw with cap resetting in any way other than literally just picking it up, moving it, put it back down when I'm actually resetting after I've zeroed. So then I can dial my holds if I'm going to do that. Getting to the use of the optic, I spent a lot of time shooting at those closer distances. It's very hard for a first focal plane reticle with glass of this quality not to be able to perform at distance. That's not something I was primarily worried on. I had 2,000 rounds to really get a feel for the optics, so I spent a lot of the time initially shooting at those closer distances, because one of the things that does come up and can be a legitimate concern with some optics is because of eye relief, you're not able to be as efficient, as quick, and as accurate at closer distances as you could be with a red dot sight, especially if that optic doesn't have a true 1 power magnification, which to my eye, to my shooting experience over 2,000 rounds, this optic is a true 1 power on the 1 power setting. At those closer distances, just based on my personal experience and knowledge and what scope shadow means in comparison to parallax, focus parallax, and alignment parallax, I didn't have any significant or really any noticeable problems at all shooting this to the same pace, to the same tempo, to the same accuracy at those closer distances that I would have done with a red dot sight. So of course, drop testing. I'm going to do a drop test every 500 rounds because that's been become my standard testing for almost anything firearm related. The durability can be a concern, or loss of zero can be a concern for the quote-unquote hard use. I used a Badger Ordnance Condition 1 mount because I'd used that mount in previous reviews and found it not to be a problem with loss of zero. One of the problems that we have with testing mounted optics like this is if it loses zero, is it the optic or is it the mount? So I went with a trusted mount, and I went ahead and did my drop test every 500 rounds. Before the first drop test, I did a 5-round group for the video to show you where the gun is zero-wise. Now, accuracy of the firearm, of course, plays into this, but this just shows the capability of the scope married with capability of the rifle, just give you an idea where the gun's hitting. So here is a 5-round group fired at the zero distance of 100 yards on 77 grain Black Hills. And then, of course, drop tests. Good bounce. And here's a 5-round group fired after the very last drop test. I think we can go ahead and call that return to zero. One thing that did happen on the final drop, though, and I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't mention this, I did lose the top turret, meaning the turret itself will no longer free adjust, no longer allow me to manipulate, to change settings, to change the settings of the rifle. However, one of the cool things just based on the design and the features of this is I remove that cap completely, and if I had to, I could still make those final adjustments, but at least it maintains zero. So yes, the top cap did break. Can't use the actual cap as intended. However, Primary Arms, from what I understand, has a great warranty, and even though I lost that cap, the rifle was maintaining zero after those 4 shoulder height drop tests on very, very hard surfaces. It seems to me that the Primary Arms Platinum line already has a pretty strong reputation among people who have spent the money, because they are more expensive than some of Primary Arms' other magnified optics. And some people may be like, well, you know, a $300 scope is going to be good enough. And I guess it depends on what you're using it for. Me personally, I shy away from optics that are that cheap because I just feel inherently that there must be something wrong with them based on my experience. And when I say wrong with them, I mean they're not going to be able to keep up with the kind of shooting that I'm likely to do or I've done in the past. I have tried budget, quote-unquote budget optics in the past, and they may have worked for a little while, but eventually something goes wrong because you do get what you pay for with a lot of firearms related stuff. So the Platinum line is a little bit more expensive, and I think you're paying not only for maybe better glass quality and better electronics, but you're also paying for an increased durability because of better materials in the manufacturing process. And of course, maybe if you're one of those people that are worried about where your optic is made, these come out of Japan versus some other country that maybe you don't like, and that's fine. I find that just working through this optic and getting 2,000 rounds, again, this is a sample size of 1, but my experience with it is it really contends well and holds its own against optics that cost maybe twice, maybe 3 times as much. If you look in the channel, some of the optics I reviewed that cost 2-3 times as much as this optic, I didn't have such great things to say about them. And again, everything's a sample size of 1. If this optic had broken to where I couldn't use it, I probably would have picked up another one just to be sure it wasn't just a one-off. And while I did have damage, I did suffer damage to that top cap, I think a lot of that has to do with just the nature of the way the rifle fell, and it just happened to hit just right 1, 2, 3, 4 times. So going forward, I'm going to have to get it fixed, but I know right now, just shot it, it's still zeroed as it was zeroed before I even did the first drop. For a first focal plane reticle that I feel is intended for intermediate to close range, maybe even home defense, or maybe a little further than your standard home defense range, I feel like this is an excellent reticle for an optic that's going to give you red dot performance, but also give the ability to shoot further or identify further. And I think that's an excellent addition to any rifle. And I think as we're starting to improve overall with the offerings of technology and the offerings of quality that we get from magnified optics, we're starting to see the red dot almost be relegated to what we used to use iron sights for. You'll notice on the review rifle that I don't have backup iron sights. I have a 45-degree mounted offset red dot because that is my backup sight. Iron sights are starting to be replaced by these red dots, whereas it used to be red dots replaced the iron sights. Now, that's not going to be true for everybody going forward, because some people are just going to have that innate fear of, if it's got a battery, then I can't trust it as my backup sight, and that's fine. But just for me, for my personal preference, and just based on likelihood and frequency and how often I check and maintenance and verify that my batteries are good and everything's good to go, this would be a good replacement for a red dot sight, which gives me that additional ability. It's not something I'm worried about. It's not like, okay, this is great, but what if I have to shoot at 5 or 10 or 15 yards? I would trust this optic at those distances just like I would trust it further out, and I think that reticle lends itself very well for I don't want to say combat distance range estimation, because this thing gives you a lot more ability, more fine-tuned holds than that. You can be really precise with this optic, especially with the adjustments that are available in that 0.1 MRAD. But on a first focal plane and on the 1 power setting with the illuminated reticle, it behaves like a red dot. And if I want to, I can dial out and knowledgeably hold for MOA hits if the rifle is capable of it. And that's not something that you get from every variable magnification optic as far as reticle choice for these first focal planes. So I think this thing, with the adjustments, the precision that you're able to do, it lends itself very well to cover both of those categories at a very reasonable price. So if you're interested in Primary Arms Platinum, especially the 1:8, this is an excellent optic for the price. I'm Aaron Cow with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.